In this video, we're going to examine the Abyssinian crisis and what it reveals about the success of the League of Nations during the 1930s. The video is broken down into 4 separate sections. First, the background of the crisis. Second, the causes of Italy's invasion. Third, the events of the Abyssinian crisis. And finally, the consequences for the League of Nations. At the top of the video, you'll see a navigation bar, and there's also timestamps so you can jump to the section that you need. Abyssinia was one of the last remaining independent states in Africa. It was ruled by its emperor Haile Selassie. Unlike Manchuria, Abyssinia was of relatively minor economic value. Although it possessed some mineral resources, much of the country was little more than rocky wasteland. Before the crisis, Britain, France and Italy had been relatively close. The 3 countries had been allies during the First World War and had worked together at the Paris Peace Conference, although Italy had not received all the territory it wanted. In April 1935, Britain, France and Italy had also formed the Strata Front. This was a united stand against German rearmament. Until Italy invaded Abyssinia in October 1935, the 3 countries could therefore be considered closely associated. One cause of the invasion was Italy's desire to expand its empire. Abyssinia was located between Italy's territories of Eritrea and Somaliland. Conquering the country would strengthen Italy's position in East Africa. There was also a desire for revenge. In 1896, Italy had suffered a humiliating defeat when it had previously attempted to conquer Abyssinia. The invasion, therefore, offered Italy an opportunity to avenge this defeat and complete the conquest they had failed to achieve in the 19th century. Italy was also disappointed by the outcome of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Although Italy had fought on the winning side during the First World War, it had failed to gain a significant share of Germany's and Turkey's former colonies. Conquering Abyssinia, therefore, offered Italy another opportunity to build a larger empire. Another important cause was Mussolini's position within Italy. Mussolini was looking for ways to increase his popularity following the economic problems caused by a recession. These problems included unemployment. A successful war appeared to offer Mussolini a way to distract attention away from Italy's economic difficulties and strengthen support for his government. War with Abyssinia appeared to be a relatively low-risk way of achieving this. A quick military victory could improve Mussolini's reputation and present Italy as a powerful imperial country. Abyssinia also appeared to be an easy target. The Abyssinian army was equipped with outdated rifles which were supplemented by spears and arrows. In contrast, the Italian army possessed modern military equipment including tanks, planes and poison gas. This meant that the Abyssinian army was unlikely to be a match for the Italian forces. Mussolini could therefore expect the invasion would result in a relatively easy Italian victory. The immediate excuse for the invasion came from a board incident at Wal Wal in December 1934. Following this incident, Mussolini began building up Italian forces in Eritrea and Somaliland. Italy was preparing to attack Abyssinia from 2 directions. In October 1935, a 2-pronged Italian invasion was launched. The attacking force involved approximately 250,000 men. Italy invaded without making any formal declaration of war. The world was soon shocked by the ruthlessness of the Italian invasion. Primitive villages and small towns which were ruled by local chiefs were destroyed by the Italians' modern military equipment. The contrast between the 2 armies was enormous. Abyssinia relied upon outdated weapons while Italy used tanks, planes and poison gas. The Italian invasion was a clear example of unprovoked aggression. The League of Nations promptly condemned Italy's invasion and imposed economic sanctions. At first, it appeared the League was determined not to repeat the mistakes it had made during the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. For a short time, the League appeared strong and determined. However, it soon became clear that the economic sanctions were having very little impact on the progress of the war. There were 2 particularly important reasons for this. First, essential war materials such as oil and coal had been excluded from the list of prohibited items. This meant that Italy was still able to obtain resources that were important for continuing the invasion. Second, Britain did not close the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was the main route used to supply the Italian army. Closing it could have made it much more difficult for Italy to continue the war. However, The canal was kept open because Britain feared possible Italian naval attacks against the British colonial possessions of Gibraltar and Malta. The sanctions, therefore, appeared to punish Italy, but they were not strong enough to stop the invasion. By December 1935, Britain and France were concerned that the League's actions were not stopping the war. To avoid further embarrassment, the British and French governments created a secret agreement known as the Hoare Pact. Under the proposed agreement, Italy would receive approximately 2/3 of Abyssinia in return for ending the war. The remaining mountainous part of Abyssinia and its ancient kingdom would continue to exist. It would be compensated for the loss of territory by receiving a narrow strip of land through Italian Eritrea, which would provide access to the sea. Mussolini indicated that he would accept the agreement. However, news of the pact was leaked to the French press. The agreement caused a storm of public protest in both Britain and France. The public believed that the two governments were preparing to reward Italy for its aggression by giving it most of Abyssinia. As a result, the plan had to be abandoned. The Hoare Pact seriously damaged confidence in Britain, France, and the League of Nations. It appeared that Britain and France were publicly supporting collective security while secretly preparing to hand most of Abyssinia to Italy. The war continued after the Hoare Pact was abandoned. The League's economic sanctions failed to stop Italy's advance. The Abyssinian capital was captured in May 1936. Italy had therefore succeeded in conquering Abyssinia. The League had condemned the invasion and imposed sanctions, but it had failed to protect one of its members from aggression. The sanctions were lifted in July 1936. This meant that Italy had been allowed to keep the territory it had conquered without facing effective punishment from the League. The Abyssinian crisis exposed serious weaknesses in the League of Nations. Britain and France had attempted to follow two contradictory policies. On the one hand, they believed that they had the responsibility to support the League and the principle of collective security. This is why they imposed economic sanctions against Italy. Britain and France, therefore, considered keeping Italy as a possible ally against Germany more important than taking effective action to protect Abyssinia. This explains why the sanctions were lifted. Oil and coal were not included and the Suez Canal remained open. Britain and France wanted to appear as though they were supporting the League, but they did not want to take measures that might lead to war with Italy. By trying to follow both policies at the same time, Britain and France achieved neither objective. The League failed to protect Abyssinia, and confidence in collective security was seriously damaged. The crisis dealt the League of Nations a blow from which it never recovered. Britain and France had hoped to keep Italy as a potential ally against Germany. However, the limited sanctions still offended Mussolini. Italy responded by moving closer to Germany. Rather than keeping Germany isolated, the actions of Britain and France helped encourage cooperation between Italy and Germany. Italy eventually left the League of Nations in 1937. Britain and France had therefore failed in both of their main objectives. They had failed to defend Abyssinia and uphold collective security. They had also failed to prevent Italy from becoming friendly with Germany. The Abyssinian crisis had a major effect on the League's role after 1936. The League's committees and commissions continued to carry out useful work during the late 1930s. However, much of its work received little public attention. On the major questions of foreign policy, the League was increasingly just ignored. The League played little or no part in the diplomacy that led to the Anschluss, the union between Germany and Austria, in March 1938. It was also not consulted during the Sudetenland crisis or at the Munich conference in September 1938. Britain and France increasingly believed that the only way to respond to an aggressive Germany was to rearm and form military alliances. They no longer relied upon the League of Nations and collective security. There were no meetings of the League's Council or Assembly during the Second World War. When the League met again in April 1946, it was for the final time. However, some important elements of the League continued. The Permanent Court of International Justice and the International Labour Organization were built into the United Nations. The United Nations also used a similar structure, including an assembly and a council. The League of Nations had been the world's first experiment in collective security. Although it failed, the idea that countries should work together to address international social and economic problems continued. The Abyssinian crisis was a disastrous failure for the League of Nations. Italy's invasion was a clear act of unprovoked aggression against another member of the League. At first, the League appeared to respond more decisively than it had during the Manchurian crisis. It quickly condemned Italy and imposed economic sanctions. However, those sanctions were too limited to stop the invasion. Oil and coal were excluded while the Suez Canal remained open. Italy was therefore able to continue supplying its army. The Hoare Pact caused even more damage. It revealed that Britain and France were secretly prepared to give Italy approximately 2/3 of Abyssinia, despite publicly claiming to support collective security. When Abyssinia's capital was captured in May 1936, sanctions were lifted in July and Italy was allowed to keep Abyssinia. Britain and France had tried to protect the League while also avoiding a confrontation with Italy. They were particularly concerned that Italy might become an ally of Germany. However, this policy failed. The League was dealt a blow from which it never recovered, while Italy moved closer to Germany and left the League in 1937. After 1936, the League was largely ignored during any major international events. The Abyssinian crisis, therefore, showed the League could condemn aggression, but it could not take effective action when its most powerful members were unwilling to accept the economic and military risks involved. Italy's invasion did not immediately end all of the League's work, but it did destroy confidence in the League as an effective system of collective security.